There is a specific phenomenon well known among veteran rangers in the southern stretch of the Appalachian chain, though you will never find it mentioned in any official safety brochure. It's called the quiet pocket. You can be walking through a dense canopy, surrounded by the crushing noise of cicadas, katydids, and wind, and within the span of a single footstep, you step into a zone of absolute, suffocating silence. The air grows heavy. Your ears ring from the sudden lack of atmospheric pressure. Most people turn around immediately when they hit a pocket. The ones who keep walking are the ones who end up in our case files. In the late autumn, a standard search and rescue call came into the station at approximately 1800 hours. A couple, experienced backpackers in their late 20s, had failed to check in at their designated campsite near Blood Mountain. The weather was dropping fast, projected to hit 28 degrees by midnight, so a two-man team was dispatched immediately. Ranger David Vance and his partner, a seasoned tracker named Marcus, took the Western Ridge Trail. By 2100 hours, they had reached the deep backcountry, miles away from any public access roads. The wind was howling through the bare branches, making communication difficult. But as they crossed a dry creek bed into a low-lying gap, the wind vanished. The trees stopped swaying. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, raising a hand to signal David. The quiet pocket had settled over the gap. David checked his radio. The indicator light was solid green, but when he keyed the mic, there was no static, just a hollow, dead tone, like a disconnected landline. Marcus pointed his flashlight toward the base of a massive, split rock formation about 50 yards off the trail. Sitting there, huddled together under a single emergency space blanket, were the missing hikers. David breathed a sigh of relief and called out to them, stepping forward. But Marcus grabbed his shoulder with a grip so tight it bruised. Marcus didn't say a word. He just slowly swept his high-lumen flashlight beam upward, away from the hikers, and into the branches of the old-growth oak tree directly above them. Perched on a thick limb, 20 feet in the air, was a figure. In the harsh white light of the LED beam, David could see it was wearing an identical bright red technical jacket to the male hiker sitting on the ground. But the proportions were entirely wrong. The arms were too long, draped awkwardly over the bark, and the face was entirely obscured by the hood, pulled down impossibly low. As the light hit it, the entity didn't flee. Instead, a sound began to emanate from the tree. It was the sound of a zipper, a metallic, sharp screeching noise that repeated over and over again, perfectly mimicking the sound of a tent door opening. Then, the figure in the tree spoke, but it didn't use a voice of its own. It spoke in a perfectly clear, high-pitched female voice, the exact voice of the woman sitting terrified under the blanket below. It said, "I think I hear something outside." Down on the ground, the real female hiker began to weep silently, covering her ears. The entity in the tree immediately shifted its voice, transitioning instantly into David's own voice, using the exact words he had spoken just moments prior. "Hey, we're Rangers. We're here to help." The imitation was flawless, down to the slight nasal undertone of David's breathing. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pulled his sidearm, fired a single warning shot into the upper canopy, and grabbed David by the tactical vest, dragging him backward toward the hikers. The gunshot broke the silence of the pocket. The moment the echo cleared, the creature didn't drop from the tree. It uncoiled, moving with a fluid, disjointed speed that Marcus later described as looking like a film skipping frames. It melted into the upper blackness of the ridgeline, the sound of its movement completely silent against the dry autumn leaves. The Rangers gathered the hikers, who were completely catatonic with fear, and began a grueling 4-hour hike back to the station. Neither hiker would look at the trees for the entire duration of the trek. The official incident report filed the next morning listed the couple's distress as severe hypothermia-induced hallucinations. But David Vance kept the audio logs from his shoulder-mounted body cam. When played back at the station, the microphone didn't record any voices. During those 10 minutes in the gap, the audio file contains nothing but the steady, rhythmic sound of a human heartbeat, beating at 300 frames per minute, a speed physically impossible for a human heart to sustain. There is a rule that every veteran search and rescue operator in the Pisgah Ridge knows by heart. If you find something in the woods that looks like it belongs in a city, you don't approach it, you don't photograph it, and you certainly do not sit on it. The deep brush has a way of swallowing historical ruins, turning old homesteads into moss-covered stone chimneys. That's normal. What isn't normal are the structures that appear overnight, perfectly clean, with no footprints leading toward them, and no heavy machinery tracks left in the mud. In the late summer, a call came into the ranger station from a frantic father. He and his 12-year-old son had been backcountry camping near an isolated, rocky outcrop, known locally as Devil's Courthouse. According to the father, they had set up camp along a well-marked perimeter. But at some point during the night, the boy had stepped out of the tent to use the restroom and simply vanished. The father woke up to the sound of the tent zipper sliding open, but by the time he got his boots on and stepped outside, the entire ridge was dead silent. Ranger Thomas Crane was part of the initial 3-man sweep team dispatched into the sector at 0200 hours. The terrain in that specific pocket of the Pisgah is brutal. Steep limestone cliffs, dense rhododendron hells that can trap a grown man, and absolute pitch-black darkness once you drop below the canopy. The team tracked a faint set of boot prints matching the boy's size for roughly 2 miles, heading directly away from the established trail and straight toward a sheer, vertical cliff face that no rational hiker would ever attempt to climb. At exactly 4:15 in the morning, Crane's team reached the base of the limestone cliff. The boot prints didn't scramble up the rock, and they didn't turn back. They just stopped dead in the mud, right at the base of the stone wall. But that wasn't what made the team halt. Resting flush against the rough, ancient mountain rock was a structure that had absolutely no business being there. It was a single, pristine flight of concrete stairs. They weren't old, weathered, or cracked. The concrete looked fresh, almost white under the beams of their high-powered flashlights, with sharp, perfect edges that looked like they had been poured that very afternoon. The staircase consisted of exactly 16 steps, rising up into the empty air and terminating in a small, flat concrete landing that led absolutely nowhere. It was just sitting there, freestanding, completely unbothered by the dense, tangled wilderness around it. Crane radioed the coordinate desk at the main station to ask if there was any historical survey record of a foundation or an abandoned fire tower in that sector. The radio dispatcher's voice came back cracked and distant, stating clearly that the sector was a designated pristine wilderness zone. Nothing had ever been built there in the history of the Park Service. As Crane was speaking to dispatch, the beam of his partner's flashlight caught something at the very top of the concrete landing. Sitting cross-legged on the top step, completely motionless, was the missing boy. He was facing away from the Rangers, staring directly into the blank rock wall of the cliff face. His flashlight was sitting beside him, turned on, its beam cutting straight up into the foggy night sky. Crane cautiously approached the base of the stairs, his boots crunching loudly on the dead leaves. He called out to the boy, telling him it was time to go home. The boy didn't move. He didn't turn around. But Crane noticed that the boy's shoulders were shaking violently, not from crying, but from a rapid, unnatural shivering. Crane took the first step onto the concrete. The moment his boot touched the stone, a massive wave of intense, blinding nausea hit him. His equilibrium vanished, his ears began to ring with a high-pitched squeal, and the digital clock on his GPS unit began cycling rapidly through random numbers. Ignoring the dizziness, Crane bolted up the remaining steps, grabbed the boy under his arms, and practically leaped off the side of the staircase back onto the forest floor. The instant his feet hit the dirt, The nausea evaporated, and his GPS returned to normal. The boy was completely uninjured physically, but his eyes were rolled back so far that only the whites were visible. He was muttering a continuous, low-amplitude stream of numbers under his breath. Coordinates that Crane later realized mapped out the exact locations of 5 other unsolved disappearances across the Appalachian chain. The official report filed for the public record stated the boy was found dehydrated in a shallow ravine. But Crane went back to that exact coordinate 2 days later during a daylight patrol. The concrete staircase was completely gone. In its place was nothing but a wide, circular patch of scorched earth where the soil had been baked so hot that the forest organisms were completely crystallized into glass. Among wilderness law enforcement, there is an unspoken agreement regarding the maps we hand out. The colored lines marking designated trails are accurate, but the blank green spaces between them are not empty. There are ridges in the West Virginia backcountry where the topography maps simply stop showing details, labeled only as restricted management zones. If a hiker goes missing inside one of those zones, the search protocols change. We don't use dogs because the hounds will freeze, lay flat on their bellies, and refuse to catch a scent. We only use eyes. In the peak of the autumn season, a distress signal was triggered via a satellite messenger device in the center of Cranberry Glades, a sprawling, boggy wilderness. The device belonged to a 24-year-old marathon runner. According to the automated text ping sent right before the device went offline, she believed she was being pursued by a tall man wearing a heavy black winter coat, despite the afternoon temperature being a humid 75 degrees. Ranger Sarah Jennings reached the last known coordinates by midnight. The ground in the glades is incredibly soft, meaning anyone running leaves deep tracks in the mud. Jennings easily found the runner's sneaker prints, but running parallel to those tracks were a second set of prints. They were massive, barefoot, and deeply impressed into the peat moss. What disturbed Jennings was the stride length. The distance between each footprint was over 9 feet apart. No human being can sprint through a dense swamp with a 9-foot stride without jumping, but these tracks showed a steady, continuous walking gait. Jennings followed the dual tracks for 3 miles until they reached the base of a steep, rocky ridgeline. There, the runner's tracks completely vanished. Her water bottle and cell phone were left sitting neatly on a flat stone, but the giant barefoot prints continued straight up the vertical rock face, ascending a gradient that required professional climbing gear. At exactly 3:40 in the morning, Jennings received a radio transmission from the secondary search team, stationed on an entirely different ridge, located 11 miles to the north. They stated they had just spotted a lone female figure standing on a high cliff edge through their thermal scopes. Jennings argued it was physically impossible. To cover 11 miles of raw Appalachian wilderness on foot in under 4 hours would require someone to move at nearly 30 miles an hour through pitch-black brush. When they finally scaled the northern ridge at daybreak, they found the missing runner. She was standing at the very edge of a 100-foot drop, completely catatonic. Her running shoes were placed perfectly side by side behind her, completely clean, with no mud or debris on the soles, despite the supposed 11-mile trek through the bog. The runner survived, but never spoke another word. The official case file was closed as an instance of acute panic-induced fugue state. But Jennings kept a copy of the satellite data. The log showed that after the runner's phone went offline, the device continued to transmit an automated location ping every 60 seconds. For 3 hours, the pings didn't move in a straight line. They zigzagged across the entire mountain range at a calculated speed of 80 miles per hour, tracing out a massive, geometric pattern across the topography map that, when connected by a line, formed a perfect human eye.